Hello everyone, welcome to Drishti IAS. You're watching the NCERT Foundation Series, wherein we study the subject of political science or polity with the help of MCQs and PYQs wherever relevant. So without further ado, let's plunge right in. Today, we are going to be starting with Class 11, Chapter 1, which is titled Constitution, Why and How. And as always, I have brought for you a quick glance into what we are going to be covering through various questions today. Please take a look at it. It talks about the meaning and functions of a constitution, limiting government powers and fundamental rights, aspirations and identity of a society, authority and effectiveness of a constitution, making of the Indian constitution, borrowed provisions from other constitutions, and this about sums up your entire chapter. Let's begin with the previous day question. Which of the following ideas is correct in the context of democracies? So in the preceding video, we were talking about democracy and what are the outcomes of democracies. So let's take a look at all of these options and arrive at the correct answer. Option A says democracies have eliminated economic inequalities. We know with the help of data as well as facts that this is in fact inaccurate. Democracies always reduce conflicts completely. Now notice and look out for words like always, completely, and I've told you that these are red flags while you are marking or trying to ascertain the correct answer. So this you can again eliminate. Option C says democracies ensure dignity and political equality. Well, this we have discussed quite a few times. Whenever we talk about democracy, we are talking about one vote, one person, and every vote to have equal value. So while we are talking about democracy, we are always talking about how everybody's vote has equal value, and this ensures political equality as well as dignity. So here we have a correct answer. Option D says democracies function best without public criticism, whereas in the preceding videos we've discussed that public criticism are the fundamental cornerstone of any democracy, without which democracies will be unable to course correct. Alright, so with this we arrive at our correct answer, which happens to be option C. Now the first question says which of the following is the primary function of a constitution? So let's revisit class 9, that was around the second or the third chapter that we were studying while we did MCQs on class 9 NCERTs, and we discussed what a constitution is. So in simple terms, constitution is basically a set of documents or a document and mainly a body of principles and rules which constitute or govern a state. So this is the most fundamental definition of a constitution. Now, a constitution also has certain functions, and your NCERT mentions 5 major ones. So let's take a look at them one by one. So we are talking over here about the functions of the constitution. The very first function can be derived from the most basic definition that we just studied. Of course, it provides a set of rules or principles to govern or constitute a state, which means these set of rules or principles ensure a minimal coordination in the society among different members of the society. All right, this is the very first function of the constitution. The second function is that it decides how decisions are taken, who takes various decisions. So, a constitution decides or lays down who makes decisions. All right, this is your second function of the constitution. Another important function of the constitution, and this has been a favorite topic for the UPSC in the preceding years, and UPSC has asked this question several times, at least 3 times in the past 5-7 years, as to Constitution basically provides certain limits to what the government can impose on its citizens. So basically, Constitution provides limits to the government which are fundamental in nature. Why do we call them fundamental limits? It's because the government cannot trespass these limits. There's a limit to what a government can do to the citizens, what it cannot do to the citizens. All right. Now the fourth function is that the Constitution enables the government to fulfill the aspirations of the people. That is the fourth function. It also means that the Constitution provides certain conditions or enables the government to provide certain conditions for a just society to take place. All right. The fifth point and the final point is that, and it's also according to your NCERT, the most important point and the most important function of the Constitution is that it helps people express themselves as a collective entity. All right. So it gives expression to the people as a fundamental identity, which means it simply means that of course people have various sorts of identity before the Constitution is formed or before they join a certain nation, a certain state and acquiesce to the Constitution. They are of course identified by various markers that could be their religion, ethnicity, caste, gender, race, right? However, once they agree to accept certain fundamental principles that are going to govern them, then these people express themselves as a collective entity, as a collective identity, and hence the Constitution actually constitutes their political identity as well. So these are the 5 basic functions of a Constitution. Now let's look at the question. Option A says guaranteeing economic growth. Again, guaranteeing is not a very favorable term to be selecting as an answer. However, in cases like fundamental rights, which are nothing but guarantees, you have to be wary while you mark the answer. However, here, while we studied about the 5 functions of the Constitution, we realized it does not mention economic growth anywhere. B, providing a set of fundamental rules for governance. Absolutely correct. That was the very first function that we studied while discussing the functions of the Constitution. C, ensuring the victory of good leaders. No, this is not the function of the Constitution, at least not the primary function. D, conducting free and fair elections. Again, not a primary function of the Constitution, but rather a precondition or a necessary condition for a democratic setup, for an effective democratic setup. So we have arrived at the correct answer, which is option B in this case. Question 2, and this happens to be a PYQ. Like I told you, it is one of the favorite topics of UPSC and has been asked in different forms. The options change, the language of the statement may change, but at least 2 or 3 times it has been asked. And the question is, the constitutional government by definition is A, government by legislature. No. When we talked about the definition of Constitution, we said that it is basically nothing but a body of principles, a set of rules that governs or constitutes a state. However, when we did the functions and we discussed 5 functions, the basic 5 ones, we talked that it is basically, it provides limits to the authority of the government, limits to what a government can impose on the citizens and what it cannot. So again, it is not a popular government. A popular government would be definitely a democracy probably, but definitely not a constitutional. By the word constitutional itself implies limited. Again, multi-party government, these are all referring to a democratic form of government. But essentially, fundamentally, in its most basic sense, a constitutional government actually means a limited government, and therefore option D is our correct answer. Question 3. The Constituent Assembly of India was elected based on the plan proposed by, and here is a list of certain plans that have been given. We'll see them one by one. A, the Mountbatten Plan, also known as the Partition Plan of India. It happened in 1947, and the Constituent Assembly does not seem to be related to it directly. B, the Wavell Plan. Now this happened in 1945, and it concerned reconstitution of the Executive Council. It concerned reconstitution of the Executive Council to include more Indians. However, this was not concerned with the Constituent Assembly. Then we come to the Cripps Mission. Cripps Mission again took place in 1942. Did mention a Constituent Assembly, but this plan failed as it was rejected by the Indian leaders. And also please notice that whenever we talk about the Constituent Assembly, it has to come much later, around let's say 1946-ish, if you are even slightly aware of the dates. So if you know when these plans or when these missions or committees were constituted, if you're aware of these dates and years, then you can at least make an educated guess that the Constituent Assembly must have to be constituted around 1946, right? So again, Cabinet Mission is the correct answer. It was under this plan that the Constituent Assembly first met in December 1946. So option D is our correct answer. Question 4. The mind of the makers of the Constitution of India is reflected in which of the following? Again, this is also a PYQ. Now it talks about the mind of the makers of the Constitution. The option first says the Preamble. Now what is the Preamble? See, Preamble talks about basically the ideals, vision and objectives of the Constitution. And whenever we talk about the Preamble, we talk about how it is the key to the Constitution, or it embodies the philosophy of the Constitution, or that it embodies the spirit of the Constitution. Every time the Preamble is discussed, we also discuss about these few keywords related to your Preamble. So naturally, the mind of the makers of the Constitution must be reflected in the Preamble. All right. The second option is the fundamental rights. You might be tempted to mark this as the correct answer, but again, fundamental rights are guarantees that ensure the proper operation of the Constitution, but they do not reflect the mind of the founding fathers of our Constitution. See the Directive Principles of State Policies, or the DPSP. Again, as the above, these are principles that enable the government to ensure some sort of a social and economic democracy. So while this is desirable, it is not absolutely fundamentally reflective of the Constitution makers' objectives. And D, the fundamental duties. Now this again was added much later by an amendment to our Constitution. So how can something that was added later be reflective of the vision of the founding fathers of our Constitution? So you can easily eliminate this. As to this, these can be confusing, these can be tricky or dicey to understand, but please understand that we are talking here about something that reflects the entire vision of the Constitution. Think about keywords that are discussed in the Preamble, like equality, fraternity, justice. These are what is reflective of the aspirations of the people as a whole. Hence, option A is the correct answer, even though you may be tempted to mark some of the other options. Question 5. The Indian Constitution derives legitimacy mainly from. Now, here are two keywords here, legitimacy as well as mainly. What do we understand by legitimacy? By legitimacy, we simply understand authority, or why do we need to follow the Constitution? Why do we abide by the Constitution? Now, here again, there are quite a few reasons, and your book talks about 3 reasons. These are: 1. Mode of promulgation. When I say mode of promulgation, I simply mean how the Constitution was crafted, how was it framed. And we know that in order to frame the Constitution, there was indeed a Constituent Assembly which comprised of various leaders from our national movements. So we had a freedom movement, and all the leaders, or most of the leaders of that national movement, actually were a part of our Constituent Assembly, which means they represented the trust of the masses. They represented the values that all the citizens stood for. Or in other words, the citizens had already shown their confidence and support for these leaders who fought for our freedom. So, obviously, when we are talking about the mode of promulgation or how it was framed, we know that it has some backing, some legitimacy, some authority to it. Hence, citizens abide by it even though there was no formal referendum. There was no formal referendum that took place in several other countries, quite a few countries, where the Constitution was put to vote directly to the public, and the public had to either accept it or reject it. But there was no such referendum in our country, and despite that, the Constitution is abided by all citizens. So the second way of deriving legitimacy is substantive fairness of provision. Substantive fairness of provisions, which means what it contains. What are the provisions of the Constitution? Now, when we talk about fairness, substantive fairness of provisions, it means that the provisions must be applicable to all citizens fairly, which means there must be something over there for all citizens. If we think that the Constitution can contain provisions that favor one group of citizens over the others, or that discriminates against one group of citizens, then it will not derive authority or legitimacy. The fact that our Constitution is an effectively working Constitution till date proves that it has fair provisions which carry something meaningful for all citizens of the country. The third way to determine the legitimacy of the Constitution is that it should have a balanced institutional design. It should have a balanced institutional design, which means no one organ of the government can subvert the other organ, and that's why we have the provisions of checks and balances, so that all the organs of the government, let's say the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, are functioning simultaneously without one trying to dominate or subvert the other. All right. So these are the 3 means with the help of which we can determine why people are following the Constitution, or why people ought to abide by the Constitution. Now, when we talk about balanced institutional design, we say this means how power is organized in simple terms. So, like if we go back to the question, what is the point of authority or point of legitimacy? A, how the Constitution was framed. B, what it contains. And C, how power is organized. Now let's take a look at the options and determine the answer. So we have these three factors over here. A, universal adult suffrage at its inception. Now this again might appear to be a tricky option, because one might feel that of course universal adult suffrage and the fact that every adult citizen gets the right to vote is what gives the Indian Constitution its legitimacy. But if you think for a moment, you'll realize that it was the Constitution that bestowed universal adult suffrage to the citizens and not the other way around. So you can eliminate this tricky looking option simply by applying your mind for a moment and thinking like this. Option B says direct referendum by citizens. No. C, broad consensus of national movement leaders. Absolutely correct. This was the first point that we discussed as to how the Constitution was framed. And we discussed that because it had the confidence and the trust of so many citizens who supported these leaders in the freedom movement, hence we can arrive at this as the correct answer. Option C being our correct answer in this case. Question 6, the Indian Constitution is described as a living document. Now, why is this described as a living document? It's a fairly straightforward question with a fairly straightforward answer, at least in this case. A says cannot be amended at all. If we are talking about something that cannot be amended at all, we are talking about something that is rigid, or I would even take the liberty to call it fossilized. Something that cannot be changed means it is a fossil already. All right. Whereas our Constitution strikes a beautiful balance between rigidity and flexibility. We know that we cannot alter the basic structure of the Constitution, but at the same time, we know that there are certain amendments that can be made relatively easily or by including the state legislatures. So it is a thorough blend of rigidity and flexibility. Strikes a balance between rigidity and flexibility? Yes. Allows unlimited power to one institution? No, this is what we discussed. Should not happen, and it checks it by a beautiful balance of design. D, ignores changing circumstances? Absolutely not. So here we have option B as our correct answer. The emphasis on public reason in the Constituent Assembly meant. Now your book highlights this concept of public reason. What does public reason mean? Of course, as the word itself suggests, that public reason has to do with reasoning and argument and justification which is open to the public. All right. So here, what it means is that in a democratic setup, every decision that is taken should be justified or supported, by reason or arguments in such a way that they are understood as well as can be evaluated by everyone else, by the others. All right. So, with reference to the Constituent Assembly, we are talking about such clauses that were, of course, so while we were framing the Constitution, every clause was subject to a rigorous debate and discussion. Nothing passed undebated except for the Universal Suffrage Clause. The only clause that went undebated and was passed unanimously was the Universal Adult Suffrage Clause. But other than that, there were leaders who favored a certain, let's say, a certain clause in the Constitution, while others opposed it. Now, in the Constituent Assembly, what happened was that everybody had to justify or support or give arguments as to why they have a certain standpoint, so that the other leaders could also understand their point of view and evaluate it, whether they agree with it and why they do not agree with it. And that's how you come or you arrive at a holistic decision. So this is exactly what happened, and this is what is meant by public reason. This also means that the leaders were not exactly propagating, they were not really forwarding their own sectional interests. They were not forwarding sectional interests or party interests or personal interests. Whatever was happening in favor of the form of government, in favor of the public in general, and all of these debates were open to the public as well, hence public reason. They were not limited, they were not done in a secret chamber, they were available to the public. So, what does public reason mean with reference to the Constituent Assembly? It means members had to justify their arguments to others with reasoned explanations. Fairly straightforward in this way. Only majority opinion was accepted without debate. No, of course, majority opinion was given a lot of weightage, but there was still a thorough debate on every clause. C, decisions were based on religious or caste considerations. Absolutely not. We've already discussed this. And D, all members acted solely in party interest. No, this is in fact, both these are conflicting and contradictory to the concept of public reason. Question 8 says, which of the following was the only provision in the Indian Constitution passed without debate? Fairly straightforward. I just gave it out to you in the previous question, and this is universal adult suffrage, which is universal adult franchisee, so do not get confused. Question 9, which factor ensures the authority of a constitution? Now, remember how we discussed the three factors that determine the legitimacy of the constitution. And here they are. Mode of promulgation, how a constitution is framed or crafted or drafted, however you want to put it. B, substantive fairness of provisions, what it contains. What it contains. And C, balanced institutional design, how power is organized. Is one organ of the government or the constitution subverting another? If yes, then there is some fault and the authority of the constitution is undermined or may be undermined. However, if there is a fine balance between institutions, then this is absolutely correct. The constitution is a legitimate one, an authoritative one. Similarly, we discussed that if there is discrimination and there is no fairness of provisions for every citizen, then eventually citizens are going to lose confidence in such a constitution. And mode of promulgation, we discussed in sufficient detail that our constitution was crafted by those leaders who enjoyed popular support, a lot of confidence, who had seen the thick and thin of the entire journey to freedom. All right, and they knew and they had developed a consensus on basic values. So there was already a consensus on basic values. These are the three things: whether how a constitution was framed, what the constitution contains, whether it does so fairly and for everyone, and D, whether or not one organ can subvert the other. And with this, we arrive at the correct answer, which is option D, all of the above. Question 10, which one of the following pairs is correctly matched regarding borrowings in the Indian Constitution? Now, Indian Constitution has borrowed a lot of provisions from different constitutions in the world, yet it was not a mindless or a slavish borrowing. It was not a mindless borrowing, and there was, of course, modification to context. It was not applied mindlessly throughout. Now, these are 4, but here I have for you. Please take a quick glance at them. the various provisions that the government has borrowed, that our constitution has borrowed from different constitutions of the world. So for example, first past the post system, parliamentary form of government, rule of law, role of the speaker and law-making procedure has been borrowed from the British Constitution. Our constitution, at least the administrative part, has been borrowed very heavily also from the Government of India Act 1935. Talking about the United States Constitution, the fundamental rights, judicial review and the independence of judiciary have been borrowed from here. The Irish Constitution has loaned to us the directive principles of state policy. The ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity again have been borrowed from the French Constitution. Think about the French Revolution. Then the quasi-federal structure. The quasi-federal structure means a federal structure but with a strong unitary bias has been taken up from the Canadian Constitution, as well as the concept of residual powers. Remember, we discussed them in one of the preceding sessions where we said that the residual powers belong to the Union. Now let's see. Directive principles of state policy, British Constitution. No, in fact, this has been borrowed from the Irish Constitution. Quasi-federal structure with strong centre. Yes, this is borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. So this has been matched rightly. Option C says fundamental rights, French Constitution. No, French Constitution has loaned to us the ideas of equality, liberty and fraternity. Fundamental rights have been borrowed from the Constitution of the US. And D says parliamentary system, Irish Constitution. No, we have borrowed it from the British Constitution. And this leads us to our correct answer, which is option B in this case. Now here I have for you the practice question. Kindly read it very carefully. Do send me your answers in the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video, kindly like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.